Right now, the annual haggle over EU fishing quotas really stepped up today when the European Commission put forward its proposals for how much can be caught in 2008. And though commissioners were warned that cod and other fish remain overfished, the surprising news is an increase in the quota for North Sea cod by 11%, a measure already agreed with Norway and a figure which, on the face of it, sounds like good news for the industry here in Scotland. Well, earlier I spoke to the Scottish Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for fisheries, Richard Lochhead. I asked him to explain the cuts proposed for days at sea and why he's worried about them.
Well, the Commission's proposals today are to cut the number of days at sea allowed for our fleet on the west of Scotland by 25% and in the North Sea by 10%. And of course the Scottish Government is extremely concerned by these proposals, but we have to of course put them into context because every year we go through this whereby the opening negotiating tactics from the European Commission inflict lots of torture on our fishing communities because there are always massive cuts being proposed, and they do that of course because then it makes it more difficult for the member states and countries like Scotland to negotiate down to zero. So it's a starting point in negotiations and run up to December's fishing talks.
Is it also a negotiating tactic that they're proposing substantial cuts in herring, whiting and plaice? Because I'd imagine the fishing communities would expect you to do a better job on that.
Well, every year, of course, we go through this where we're also trying to cut the potential of massive cuts in some vital stocks, but we do recognise that in some stocks there is a case for reducing quota to protect those stocks because we have to listen to the scientific advice. But of course there's always a bit of to and froing, and what we have to concern ourselves about in Scotland is what our share of the overall allowable catch will be in terms of the whole of Europe, or at least the states that will fish these particular waters. So we've got a big battle ahead of us in the run up to December's talks, we recognise that. We have of course come through the EU-Norway discussions that took place last week and earlier this week, which did result in a 10% increase in North Sea cod for Scotland. So some of the fishing opportunities have been decided already.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. That's for cod. How is it that Norway and the UK, or Scotland in particular, can get this increase when the rest of Europe has to have a decrease? It's difficult to understand how that's sustainable.
Well, each fishery is taking on its merits, and we're talking about North Sea cod in this particular case. Now, Scotland's fleets have bent over backwards in recent years to conserve cod stocks, and what we've seen, of course, is a high level of discarding whereby the fishermen are catching good quality adult cod but unable to land it because they've not been given enough quota. So the European Commission for once recognised that, and indeed the Norwegians, and we had an increase of 10% in cod quota to recognise the increasing number of fish on the grounds.
But
that's the first time in 10 years that's happened.
Scientists were saying just last month the actual quota should be half what they were in 2006 terms.
But of course, last year they were saying there should be no quota whatsoever, and when they said that...
So do you ignore their advice, or just do you get different scientific advice that agrees with you?
Well, if you listen to the scientists sometimes, you have to respond to their advice, of course you do, but it's the job of the governments to respond to the advice because the advice is always shrouded in some uncertainty. It varies from year to year, there's a huge margin of error, and we have to, of course, take into account the socio-economic impact of having no quota, which would destroy our fishing communities.
Yeah, but hang on, the science is at the bottom of this. Do you wonder if, I don't know, the dodo hunters were told you're running out of dodos and they thought, quick, let's go and shoot some more? I mean, how can you possibly conserve things by getting more of them out to sea?
Well, can I make one important point to you, which is last year, of course, they said there should be no catching of cod in the North Sea, but the stock continued to increase when there was fishing. So we have to just put things into perspective. Yes, we have to listen to science, of course we do that. And that's why we've taken so many measures in Scotland's waters to protect juvenile cod stocks with a great deal of success. And we've got new initiatives being adopted by Scotland's fleet, which is ahead of the rest of Europe. And we're being commended by other countries by what we're doing in Scottish waters with Scottish fishermen, taking measures to protect juvenile cod stocks, which is great for the future, of course, and it's very important we do that.
Is this going to see less of them being thrown back? You know, the ones that there's bycatch, that where you find healthy cod caught, but because it's not part of the quota, that they have to be thrown back dead?
Exactly, and that's why it's so important we do tackle the level of discards. One way of doing that is to ensure the quota that's given to the fishermen to land the stock is more in line with the amount of fish that's actually in the sea, because otherwise they just catch it and have to throw it back overboard in a mixed fishery like we have in the North Sea. And secondly, we have to take measures to reduce the number of fish being caught in the first place that we shouldn't be catching, like juvenile fish and juvenile cod stocks. And our fleet, as I say, are ahead of the rest of Europe in putting in place innovative measures like voluntary real-time closures, where if they come across juvenile cod stocks, they automatically close on the area of the sea and avoid that to protect the future of these stocks.
On a political point, who will be leading the UK negotiations in 3 weeks? Will it be you or will it be the UK's Fishery Minister?
Well, the UK Fishing Minister is leading the talks in Brussels in December.
Because you said in opposition it would be you.
No, what I've said is the SNP government would demand that we get to lead those talks. We've put that request to the UK government. They're not quite engaging with us at the moment in that debate. Because
so you have to negotiate with them and negotiate with Europe at the same time. That's going to be tricky.
Well, that's right. We've got a huge task in Scotland. We seem to succeed to a certain degree last week. Perhaps that's a sign of the progress being made by the new SNP government. We have to make sure the UK understands Scotland's case, and in turn the UK have to ensure, along with Scotland, that the rest of the European Union understands Scotland's case as well. And that's
is this going to be another fight? Is this going to be another cross-border fight between you and Edinburgh and down the road in London?
Well, I think as last week's negotiations and hopefully December's negotiations will illustrate as well, the Scottish Government have actually brought a huge positive contribution to the negotiations, because we have put
but how hard are you going to push for this? You said you would demand this. How hard are you going to demand?
Well, the first thing to say is that leading the official delegation from the UK is not just about who sits at the top table. That's part of it. It's about the few months in the run-up to the December talks and who has access to the UK's negotiating machinery, who Europe recognises as a lead minister for the whole of the UK as well, in the few months when a lot of the hard work is done in the run-up to the December talks.
So it's not going to be you. You're not going to be sat in the chair.
Well, we've not been in the lead this year. We've made a huge positive contribution. We've made a positive difference, because I think if you ask any Scottish fishermen, they'll recognise that what's been happening over the last few months is a lot more positive and transparent than at previous EU fisheries councils. But we'll continue the battle to get justice for Scotland, because we've got 70% of the UK's fishing industry in Scotland, and we believe because we've got the biggest stake in the outcome of these negotiations, we could have the biggest input to them as well, and that means leading for the whole of the UK until we get independence, where we can get out of the common fisheries policy and do what's right for Scotland's fishing communities.
Richard Lockett, thanks very much indeed for coming in tonight. No papers tonight, as some news is just coming in as we are on air. The NatWest 3 bankers, David Birmingham, Giles Darby and the Scot Jerry Mulgrew, have pleaded guilty in connection with an Enron-related fraud case at a US district court in Houston, Texas. Under the terms of the plea agreement, each defendant will serve 37 months in jail after admitting one of the 7 counts of wire fraud which they faced. More on that on News 24 and tomorrow on Good Morning Scotland. Thanks for watching. That's all from Newsnight Scotland. Good night.